Double duty for today's retrospective, covering two bands today, Atrophy and Morbid Saint. Now you may be asking yourself, Radon666, why are you doing two bands today instead of one? You trying to pad this video's runtime for ad revenue?
What? No!
I'm covering these two bands because they both have similar profiles. You know, both bands released a couple albums in the heyday of classic thrash metal, but both of these bands ended up reforming in the 2010s. Both of them released their comeback album in the year 2024, and those albums were released 6 weeks within each other, so I figured, hey, why not, just cover them both in the same video. So, Atrophy, they were first to release, so we're going to start with them. So let's talk about their debut album, Socialized Hate, from 1988. And I mean, just look at this album art. I mean, that's what really drew me into this album when I first saw it. Have you ever seen a more, late 80s thrash metal album cover? Now, I'm not going to glaze this album unnecessarily. I mean, don't get me wrong, the songs are very good. It is a very good album. But this album is pretty, meat and potatoes kind of thrash metal.
Born to kill, there's no retreat. Live to fight, a killing machine.
Now, I'm not really a thrash expert, but just by my ears, not vocally speaking, strictly musically speaking, I would say the best comparisons I could make would be to bands kind of similar to like Testament or Forbidden. And while I would say that, Forbidden and Testament have more kind of classically like musical singers, Atrophy's Brian Zimmerman, he has more of like a gruff kind of thrash vocal. Kind of reminds me of like Razor's Bob Reed. But yeah, I mean, if you love late 80s classic American thrash metal, give it a spin. Then we have Morbid Saint's debut album, Spectrum of Death, from 1990. Now, technically speaking, this actually is a demo. It's not really an album. They eventually released it as an album. And quite frankly, I think it is one of the greatest thrash metal albums of all time. See my top 10 thrash metal album rankings. But part of the reason I hold this album in such high regard is that it's super fast, super heavy, and super raw. Listening to this album at the time, it reawakened my passion for thrash metal. At the time, I was really digging my teeth into black metal. And thrash metal bands like Exodus and Death Angel, they just weren't really doing it for me. But hearing thrash metal with this kind of super raw black metal-esque production and almost kind of black metal vocals, it just had me fiending for more. Hey, cut the camera. You weren't supposed to see that. I wanted more of this harder edge thrash, as I kind of like to call it. So, I started getting into bands like Sodom and Creator. Even got into some newer thrash metal bands like Warbringer. So, for that, I am thankful. But to sum up this album pretty succinctly, imagine if Slayer, when they were going to record Rain and Blood, blew whatever pitiful production budget that they had on bath salts, and then took whatever $20 they had left and spent it to produce Rain and Blood. Then, in 1990, Atrophy released their second album, Violent by Nature, which I would say is pretty similar to what they did on the previous album. I think it's a continuation of their sound. I would say only slight difference, I would say, is with the lyrics. On the debut albums, it talked a lot about, social issues like racism, religious dogma / exploitation, conformity, things like that. And this album also discusses those things, don't get me wrong, but I feel like the debut album was more kind of finger-pointing, like more outwardly defiant and critical, whereas this album seems almost a bit more inward-looking and kind of more just sternly, disappointed and jaded, or cynical, if that makes sense. Take the song Slip Through the Cracks. You know, that's a song about people that just kind of flame out in life, whether, you know, they get involved with gangs or they, you know, spend too much time dicking around instead of focusing on important things. You have the song In Their Eyes, which, you know, is kind of like, oh, if only the world was as simple as it is perceived through a child's eyes. Or take, for example, the song Right to Die, which, you know, on the surface, it's a song about someone with like a painful terminal illness. They want to have the right to, you know, be able to euthanize themselves. But quite frankly, I think this song is probably, you know, that's used more as an analogy for like existential dread and things like that, because the vocalist, he's got a line in the song that kind of goes like this. But outside of the tracks that I mentioned before, I would say some of the other songs that I really like on this album are the title track and Puppies and Friends. Next, we have Morbid Saint's demo that was also later released as an album, although at the time no labels ended up picking it up. 1992's Destruction System. Now, at the time in 1992, this demo wasn't actually released. It ended up getting released after the band reformed in 2010, and this demo was released, you know, it got mastered and got touched up a bit. It wasn't re-recorded, but just got touched up, and then got released in 2015. First thing I'll say about this album is that it's definitely not as intense as Spectrum of Death. I mean, quite frankly, I don't think you can keep up that level of intensity for longer than 30 minutes. But I just like to imagine that, you know, as they were on tour, playing shows, playing the songs from this album, they were just like, oh man, this shit is hard. Can we just like, you know, tone it down a bit, guys? But don't get me wrong. You know, the production is touched up. The songs may not be as intense, but this is still a goddamn thrash metal album, people. I mean, Morbid Saint is still gonna be fucking kicking your ass. Vocalist Pat Lind, he still sounds as rabid as ever. And overall, I'd say it's a pretty consistent album, you know? No sophomore slump here. After 34 years of laying dormant, Atrophy graced us with their comeback. 2024's Asylum. I featured this album in my top 10 albums of 2024, and outside of one other YouTuber, I haven't seen a single soul mention this album. And to me, that is just an absolute indictment on our culture. You know, when this album came out, people were listening to Black Gaze, they were listening to Metallica's 72 Seasons. I mean, it's just pitiful, and it's an absolute disgrace. Punishment for all. So as far as this band's lineup goes right now, the only kind of original member from the glory days is vocalist Brian Zimmerman. Everyone else in the band is a new recruit that joined between 2021 and 2023. Although the other original members of Atrophy, they have their own project called Scars of Atrophy, which released an EP in 2022. Once again, the lyrical themes on this album kind of revolve around, you know, societal concerns and individual existential dread. I can hear the voices calling from the grave. I can see the sadness written on the face. And I would say my favorite songs from the album are Punishment for All, Seeds of Sorrow, and Bleeding Out. And finally, we have Morbid Saint's comeback album, 2024's Swallowed by Hell. How often does a band age 30 years and somehow still get heavier? Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think this album is, you know, heavier than Spectrum of Death, but I think this album is heavier than Destruction System. I mean, at a bare minimum, the songs are played on average at a faster tempo. Although you do also have some kind of Destruction System-esque kind of groovy type songs. You know, see the lead single from this album, Pine Tuxedo. Pine But this album is just super, super solid throughout. I'd give it at least an 8 out of 10. I think that 77% score on Metal Archives is an absolute disgrace. And honestly, I think I might like this album more than Destruction System. So that is my treatise on Atrophy and Morbid Saint. I've always had an interest in some of these kind of obscure 80s thrash bands that maybe only put out an album or two before they kind of flamed out. So if you know of any good, quality bands like that, leave them down in the comments below. And yeah, go get a job.